Spoštovane gospe in gospodje, drage kolegice in kolegi, lepo pozdravljeni na današnjem predavanju našega dragega gosta, profesorja Oliverja Jensa Schmitta. Za začetek mi dovolite par besed, da ga pozdravim. Ich werde zuerst ein paar Wörter in Slowenisch sagen und den Autor vorstellen und zugleich begrüße ich auch den Herrn Botschafter. Herzlich willkommen bei uns. Nicht erstes Mal und wahrscheinlich, und sicher auch nicht letztes Mal. Torej, profesor Oliver Jens Schmitt je doma iz Basla v Švici, kjer je tudi študiral vzhodnoevropsko zgodovino, bizantinistiko in grecistiko, vendar ne samo v Baslu, tudi na Dunaju, v Berlinu in v Münchnu, in se leta 2003 habilitiral v Regensburgu za področje zgodovine vzhodne in jugovzhodne Evrope in je od leta 2005 profesor na univerzi na Dunaju, in sicer je njegov matični inštitut, Inštitut za vzhodnoevropsko zgodovino, ki ga je nekaj časa tudi vodil. Raziskovalno in tudi kot predavatelj je deloval na številnih univerzah jugovzhodne Evrope, predvsem, vendar tudi v Italiji, in bil leta 2010 tudi gostujoči profesor na prestižnem Collège de France. Odlikuje ga izjemna širina raziskovanja, ki sega od srednjega veka pa vse do 20. stoletja, kjer se je recimo ukvarjal s fašizmom v jugovzhodni Evropi v primerjalni perspektivi. Pri tem ni nič manj fascinantno njegovo jezikovno znanje, ki mu omogoča suvereno obvladovanje in zelo različnih historiografij. Odlikuje ga tudi velik smisel za sintezo in ta knjiga je gotovo lepa priča tega njegovega načina delovanja. In na tem mestu želim izpostaviti, da je bil avtor in predvsem urednik zelo obsežne in danes bi rekel temeljnega priročnika za zgodovino jugovzhodne Evrope, to je Handbuch zur Geschichte Südosteuropas, ki je do zdaj išla v več zvezkih v 2 knjigah in obravnava zgodovino omenjenega prostora od antike do leta 1800. Projekt pa še ni končan. Med drugim je veliko pozornost posvečal tudi albanski zgodovini in napisal pregled zgodovine Kosova in postal zaradi tega tudi dopisni član Kosovske akademije znanosti in umetnosti. Zlasti odmevna je bila tudi njegova biografija o Skenderbegu, v kateri je bil seveda zelo kritičen do mitov, in ki so v albanski javnosti pa tudi v zgodovinopisju povezani s to zgodovino, zaradi česar je bil deležen ostrih napadov. Poleg tega je član Instituto Veneto di Scienze Lettere d'Arti v Benetkah, predvsem pa je od leta 2009 tudi član Avstrijske akademije znanosti, kjer je postal leta 2011 njen redni član in je bil v letih 2017-2022 predsednik njenega filozofsko-historičnega razreda. Pri tem morate vedeti, da ima Avstrijska akademija samo 2 razreda in je bil s tem tudi član predsedstva akademije. In je tudi znanstveni direktor Akademijskega inštituta za raziskovanje Habsburške monarhije in balkanskega prostora. Tesno sodeluje z Slovensko akademijo znanosti in umetnosti in je bistveno prispeval, tako kot zgodovinar in kot tudi takratni član predsedstva Avstrijske akademije, da smo lani izdali knjigo o slovensko-avstrijski zgodovini na obeh straneh Alp, ki je istočasno išla v nemški in slovenski izdaji in smo v tej dvorani predstavili slovenski javnosti lani junija. Povod za današnje predavanje je njegova zadnja knjiga Moskvas westliche Rivalen, to je ta knjiga tukaj, in sicer o evropski zgodovini od Nordkapa do Črnega morja, ki je prav tako išla v preteklem letu v nemščini, in zaradi vojne v Ukrajini, ki je bolj kot je običajno usmerila naš pogled v vzhodno Evropo in njeno zgodovino, je ta knjiga še kako aktualna, saj obravnava zgodovino omenjenega prostora od srednjega veka oziroma od Kijevske Rusije do današnjega časa. Preden prepustim besedo našemu predavatelju, naj še omenim, da je za to knjigo letos prejel glavno nagrado Bruno Krajskega za politično knjigo v letu 2025 in v utemeljitvi je med drugim rečeno, in dovolite mi še ta citat, avtor pokaže, da izvirajo vzroki za konflikte med Rusijo in njenimi zahodnimi sosedami iz različnih političnih kultur. V sosednjih državah Rusije so se zgodaj razvile oblike institucionalizirane participacije, ki so omejevale oblast vladarja ter spodbujale razumevanje prava in svobode. V Rusiji pa politično samorazumevanje zaznamuje avtokratska tradicija. Zgodovinska izkušnja s parlamentarno soodločitvijo in ustavna tradicija so tam komaj prisotne. Zato se je lahko Vladimir Putin v svojem narativu o vojni v Ukrajini navezuje na tradicionalne imperialno-vojne legitimacije. Knjiga na izjemno podroben in razumljiv način osvetljuje zgodovinske in idejno-politične tokove. Schmittova analiza poglablja naše razumevanje sodobnih konfliktov ter odpira nove poglede v geopolitične izzive Evrope. K temu lahko dodam, da odpira knjiga tudi nove poglede na historiografske pristope in perspektive in prav o tem bo spregovoril v današnjem predavanju. Lieber Oliver, den Pult ist jetzt dein, bitte.
Spoštovani gospod predsednik, dragi Peter, spoštovani člani Slovenske akademije znanosti in umetnosti, spoštovani gospod veleposlanik, spoštovane gospe in gospodče. Za mene je velika čast, da lahko danes govorim pred vami in zato se vaši akademiji iskreno zahvaljujem. To povabilo razumem tudi kot nadaljnji znak posebnega sodelovanja med vašo in Avstrijsko akademijo. Naša skupna zgodovinska knjiga, ki smo jo lani izdali in med drugim predstavili tudi tukaj na akademiji, je vidni izraz tega sodelovanja. Avstrijska akademija s nobenim drugim partnerjem ne izvaja tako intenzivnega skupnega publikacijskega projekta in menim, da to poudarja tudi kakovost našega izmenjavanja. Svoj govor bo imel v angleškem jeziku in se vam zahvaljujem za potrpežljivost, s katero ste prenašali mojo slovenščino s močnim helvetskim naglasom. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, so in the following 50 minutes, unfortunately not in Slovenian, but in English, I will try to develop some ideas already outlined by President Peter Stich. Russia's invasion of Ukraine just over 4 years ago shook Europe to its foundations, but it also shook all those who study Eastern Europe academically. And this is primarily the discipline I represent, namely the history of Eastern Europe, which has been taught at many universities in Western countries, or in the English-speaking and German-speaking mainly, for more than 100 years. But did this discipline indirectly and unwittingly contribute to Russian aggression, namely by expressing too much understanding for Russian narratives and interests on the one hand, and by rendering the objects of Russian power politics invisible on the other? Many of you probably will be reminded on Yugoslav studies prior to Slovenian independence, where the, let's say, many republics simply were overlooked by foreign analysts, and languages as Slovenian and Macedonians were almost not studied at Western University, but because people simply believed that Serbo-Croatian was the language of the countries and the others were more or less similar to that and it worthy to be studied. So this question is now be asked on a completely different level, but probably many of you will be reminded features of what most of you lived in the 80s and early 30s. In fact, for many decades, Eastern European history was synonymous with Russian history, as Yugoslav history was synonymous with, let's say, Stockavian history. Russian was the first and often the only language that specialists learned. Once again, can be compared to the situation with Yugoslav studies in the 80s, and influenced by Russian research and language stages in the former Soviet Union, they essentially reproduced the grand narrative of an empire that began in Kiev in the 9th century, shifted its focus to Moscow after the Mongol invasion, and from there, from Peter I onwards, rose to become a European power that defeated Napoleon in the 19th century, Hitler in the 20th century, first as a European hegemonic power in the first half of the 19th century, and then after 1945 as one of the two superpowers. This narrative was straightforward and always focused on imperial centers, namely Petersburg and later on Leningrad and Moscow. The list of societies that have been invaded and conquered by these empires since the Middle Ages is very long, and even if we do not look to Central Asia, but only to Europe. So it stretches from Norway to Moldova, and in common narrative, it is either not mentioned at all or only briefly as part of inevitable imperial expansion. As a result, Ukraine, the second largest European state, at least in territorial terms after Russia, simply disappeared for decades from the consciousness of historians, and from there to journalists, diplomats, and politicians who more or less were trained by these historians and reproduced their discourses. Around 1990, only a few Ukrainian exiles in Canada and the United States were concerned with this topic. The Ukrainian language also virtually disappeared from East European studies, and for a long time there was not even a German-Ukrainian dictionary, because main editors simply believed that it's not necessary because this is more or less the same language and Ukrainians would speak Russian anyway. Well, today there is a wide selection of overviews on Ukrainian history, and this is not at least due to the activity of the University of Vienna, my institute, who in a kind of completely anti-cyclical development focused on Ukraine when Ukraine did not matter, so in the early 90s. There is now a huge selection on the German book market. But I mean, you will remember the same is also true for former Yugoslavia. There was until 1998 no history of Kosovo at all in accessible language. And you also know that here there are some authors of a history of Slovenia that was in the 1990s an absolute necessity. So it really matters if knowledge is available and also in accessible form. And I think academies and historians here have a particularly important role. Because knowledge is power, this wisdom is as banal as it is important. If there is little knowledge about the state or society in important political decision-making centers, so in Washington or Brussels, this can become existentially dangerous for those affected in times of crisis. If you simply do not know anything about the country simply does not exist, its interests cannot be understood. And it becomes even more problematic when the aggressor uses its understanding of history to justify its policies, and we are witnessing a period in which history comes back, and historical knowledge is essential also for political decision takers in a way it has not been the case for decades. Russia does this to a great extent and baffles Western decision makers with lessons about the 9th or the 17th century given by the Russian president himself. And we can even speak about the clash between different understandings of time, and this is emblematic in the interview between the right-wing populist journalist Tucker Carlson and the Russian president. So Carlson was completely overwhelmed by Putin's historical explanations, for he could neither understand his counterpart's argument nor contextualize the facts. So what answer can Eastern European history provide now that it has to come to realize that its focus has led to a discursive and political disappearance of entire societies, so not only Ukraine? Initial attempts to decenter the history of this largest European historical area, so Eastern Europe from Russia, date back to the early 1990s. So this is now a kind of brief historiographical overview. The collapse of the Soviet Union revealed, as in the case of the collapse of Yugoslavia, the existence of many nations that had been largely forgotten during the Cold War. And the list is very long. So the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, the Moldovans, but also former vassal states of the Soviet Union, such as Poland. My colleague Andreas Kappeler, one of the leading experts of Ukrainian history when it was not fashionable at all, published at that time the book Russia as a Multinational Empire and made ethnic diversity visible for the first time. The eminent Berlin-based historian Klaus Zernak wrote an entangled history of Poland and Russia as partners and rivals, in which Poland was not simply the object of Russian imperial strategy. Around 2000, so about roughly 25 years ago, so-called empire studies took off, mainly in the United States, understanding empires as multi-ethnic entities in which both the center and the periphery had to be examined equally. All this increased, of course, the visibility of non-Russian societies, and all this cemented the idea that these societies from the North Cape to the Black Seas always should be viewed within a Russian imperial framework. So they were visible but still part of the empire. Or in other words, that they historically belonged to a Russian sphere of influence. And this legitimizes implicitly and often, but not always unwittingly, the hegemonic claim that Russia wants to enforce by force before our very eyes. We must therefore go one step further and consider Russians' immediate Western neighbors as independent historical actors and not just as objects of imperial strategy, both, and that's very important, before and after the empire. And in many cases, this rule lasted much less time than is commonly assumed. Just an example, Belarus, presented as, let's say, ancestral part of Russia, was annexed by Russia in 1793. So very, very late. So there is no tradition of Muscovite rule in this area. This was traditionally one of the core area of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, but who actually knows that? So the starting point is an observation that from the present that is shaping our continent. The starting point also of this book, that simply the states of the northeast of our continent have reacted 4 years ago very differently to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine than, for instance, those in the Pannonian Basin, or even more those in the south, namely Spain or Italy. Today, a new security architecture is emerging in which the United Kingdom, Germany, the Nordic and Baltic states, Poland, and also in the far south, even in poor Moldova, and of course Ukraine, are effectively forming a bloc that is opposing Russia. This is, let's say, common observation that no one can deny, but the historian has to ask, does this development have historical roots? Why are Russian neighbors behaving so differently from the rest of Europe? I mean, what's the deeper meaning and what's the entire conflict actually about? To answer these questions, a new model must be developed that examines the relation of societies from the North Cape to the Black Sea with the Moscow state. A long series of present-day states have to be examined, namely, and now the list is very long, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Poland, and Ukraine and Moldova. The length of these lists alone underscores the complexity of this undertaking, which is also a novelty in historical research. Until now, bilateral studies, so Russia and Estonia, Russia and Belarus and so on, have predominated. Moreover, and this is very important from a practical point of view and a methodological one, Nordic and Eastern European history are largely researched completely separately. I mean, in states as, for instance, Denmark, there is almost no school of East European history, bit of political sciences, and it's astonishing the degree of disconnection between European historiographies, and this is especially true for one region that is always presented as a bloc, namely the Baltic area. We had just had a lecture series on Lithuanian history at the University of Vienna with leading specialists from Lithuania, and they all said we have no contacts to Latvia. It's a direct neighbor. There is completely different interpretation of the past. Lithuania was the biggest, in territorial terms, the biggest state in Europe. Latvians have no history. We have a history. We were once one of the biggest states of Europe. They do not count. And then the confessional difference, we are Catholic. They are Protestant or non-believers. They are peasants. We are noble nation. And then from the outside, you always can read in the newspapers about Baltic solidarity. This exists on the political and military level, but below, this was also discovery from me when I was lecturing in Vilnius recently. This is not at all the case. So they are bits and pieces, and there is no connection between these historiographies, and that's one of the main methodological challenges, apart from the fact that most of important publications are published in national languages and very scattered and accessible only to specialists. But I mean, it's not an exception in Europe. That's the way we are still doing history on a national level. So the method must therefore be designed as follows. Instead of just adding up national cases, so Poland and Belarus and Ukraine and so on, let's say starting from modern borders, an entangled history of Moscow's Western neighbors must be written. So we have to bring together, where it makes sense, these different historical experiences. At the same time, this history must be linked to that of Moscow. You cannot just write out Russia of this kind of history. Decentering does not mean eliminating or reducing completely the visibility. It's just shifting the focus. And finally, of course, this part of Europe that is at the center, and you can see it on the book cover, is also part of a wider European West and was heavily influenced by the great powers, and they are all based in the West, starting from Great Britain, France, Austria, and Prussia, and so on. So it's an extremely complex methodological setting, and it's even becomes even more challenging because we have to study 8 centuries from the emergence of a Muscovite state in the 13th century to the present day to understand this kind of neighborhood. So once the object of studies in terms of space and time has been defined in this way, the question arises as to whether theoretical insights can be derived beyond the mere compilation. I mean, historian can put together facts, but what's the meaning of these facts, and why do we start this kind of endeavor, and how should this be positioned in relation to existing theories? And now I will briefly focus on theories on this space and what they actually mean. The major question is, where does Europe end? Our area of study was once called Inter-Europe, zwischen Europa, mainly interwar period when the empire broke down, so the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian, and the German Empire, and meaning in generally the entire area between Germany and the Soviet Union. French foreign policy spoke at that time of the cordon sanitaire, a kind of sanitary cordon, and this is also a kind of concept that stretches back to the 18th century when France wanted to build against Austria a huge system of alliances encompassing Sweden, Poland, Lithuania, and the Ottoman Empire. So this interwar French policy had also a kind of prehistory in the 18th century. But there are also important theories developed within the region, and the most important I want to quote is the great Polish historian Oskar Halecki, who actually coined the term East Central Europe. That essentially corresponded to what was once the largest European state on the map, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And Halecki saw this huge state as a kind of Catholic bulwark against the Orthodox East, and he wrote that as a political exile in the United States during the Cold War. So East Central Europe was a way to remind Europeans that beyond the Iron Curtain, there is still Europe, and this Europe is completely different from a space that is not European, and it's the Orthodox Russian space. So this was a very strong Cold War interpretation. Particularly influential is the theory of the American political scientist Samuel Huntington, who in his work, I mean, most of you will at least be familiar with the title, Clash of Civilizations, spoke of an orthodox cultural sphere dominated by Russia and with little potential for democratic development. So orthodoxy means no democracy, I mean, to simplify things. But, and Belarus and Ukraine, which Halecki, according in his theory, considered essential parts of East Central Europe, though not part of a Russian sphere of influence, were in Huntington's interpretation the complete opposite, integral part of a non-democratic Orthodox Europe. Both Halecki and Huntington based their theories on cultural differences, more specifically on religious dominations. It was mainly about Catholic, Protestant versus Orthodox world, and then there was a relation between confession and political system. And according to both of them, where the tradition of Rome prevailed, or post-Roman Christianity, in the case of the Protestant churches, there was the West. And beyond that, in the Orthodox world, there was the East. And interestingly, Russian imperial thinkers saw and see it still in much the same way. What is Orthodox and East Slavic is Russian. We want to show, and that's the main purpose of this book, that these theories are not accurate. On the contrary, the real dividing line, Peter Stich already highlighted that, in Europe does not run along between Catholic and Orthodox world. It runs straight through the Orthodox world. And this dividing line dates back to the 14th and 15th century. To the West was the part of the old Kievan Rus that was conquered by Lithuania. So it's a Lithuanian Rus that corresponds to present-day Belarus and Ukraine. And east of it is a Muscovite Rus that represents a completely different political culture. So it is not language nor religion, but political culture that determines the borders of Europe. Which does not mean that it's a constant line, and this line could not be shifted or changed, but it stands at the core, and now I have to define what does political culture actually mean. The first element is institutionalized participation. That means noble parliaments, estates. So there is a kind of institutionalized forum where representatives on the country meet and discuss with the ruler, and they have clearly defined competencies, mainly in very sensitive issues, namely budget. Second, formal restriction of royal power or the power of the ruler through electoral capitulations, so written negotiations between the voters and the king, and in the case of Poland, Lithuania, even the guaranteed right of resistance. This was absolutely, it did not exist in the Habsburg Empire, for instance, should the monarch violate the fundamental laws of the state. Third, a written law that is also observed in practice and internalized by the political and social elites. And fourth, formulated and theoretically defined political concepts of law and freedom, so that people do not just assume that freedom and law are important, but this is really also developed in political, in treatises with a wide reception and also internalized by political elites. So this is meant by political culture. Applying these criteria, societies that are orthodox in terms of religion and linguistically influenced by East Slavic, such as Belarus and Ukraine, are historically part of a European political culture. And let's say, to develop the argument even further, the states that were direct neighbors of Russia had parliamentary tradition that was much higher developed than in the center of Europe. So Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, and Livonia, so present-day Latvia and Estonia, had parliaments whose strength was far beyond everything you can observe in the Habsburg monarchy, in Italy, or in France. That's why you have a clash of civilizations, but it's not confessions, but really the strength of parliaments. And nowhere have parliaments been stronger than in the direct neighbors of Russia, and nowhere have parliaments been as unexisting or as weak as in the Muscovite Empire. So now, and I also now have to visualize that a little bit. So we will elaborate these ideas in more details below, but now I owe you a kind of brief overview and also a spatial visualization so that you can understand how this very long time span of 800 years can be brought into the analysis. So we can roughly distinguish between different phases, and the first one is certainly the phase of the superiority of the Western neighbors going up to 1500s, and you can see here this Western neighbors. I hope I have. Where do I have to press here? Yeah, here it is. So you have the huge kingdom of Sweden that encompassed also Finland. Then Livonia, I already mentioned, corresponds more or less to present-day Estonia and the northern part of Latvia. And then the huge Grand Duchy of Lithuania, one of the biggest states. And as I said, the main competitor of Moscow. You see how small the Grand Duchy of Moscow was at that time, and Lithuanian armies failed 3 times before the Kremlin around 1370. So there was a real chance that Moscow would have become a provincial town of Lithuania. This is phase 1. Phase 2 is characterized by a very unstable balance of power, and here you see the moment of absolute apogee of Western power. You see how close the frontier between Lithuania and Muscovy was in spatial terms. So Lithuania was really, I mean, it's a bit exaggerated, in the outskirts of Moscow. In the early 17th century, Western troops occupied twice the Kremlin. So you know that Russian propaganda always said Napoleon failed, Hitler failed, but Sweden and Poland, Lithuania did not fail. Swedish troops occupied the Kremlin in 1610, and then there was a 2 years occupation of the Kremlin by Polish-Lithuanian troops. This is in Russian self-perception extremely important. They are important historical movie. In the West, it's completely forgotten because Putin remembers medieval and early modern history, and our decision takers, I mean, mostly focus on the 20th century. That's one of the biggest mistakes when it comes to history, and that's why also in this book, medieval and early modern history are really at the core, because they, for us in the West, it does not matter. And in other historical regions, these are the periods of reference. You see there was no access of Muscovy to the Baltic Sea. You see how far to the east ran the eastern border of the Swedish kingdom, and that Poland, Lithuania did not only control most of present-day Ukraine and of course Belarus, but significant parts of what is nowadays Western Russia. So Smolensk was a Lithuanian provincial town. Then there was a complete reversal of powers, and this started with Peter I, and in the 18th century, Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden became actually vassal states of the Russian Empire. They lost, there was a deep crisis in the mid-17th century in Poland, Lithuania, also with a demographic breakdown that can be compared to the 30 Years' War in Central Europe, and Sweden lost a long war, 21 years of wars against Russia, and the result was not only a breakthrough of Russia to the Baltic Sea, but mainly a completely new political system. Both of the former great power now were vassal states, and one of these vassal states was then annexed by Poland, but also Austria and Prussia. That is Poland, Lithuania. Once the biggest East European power completely disappeared from the map. Sweden was decimated. It lost 40% of its territory, namely Finland. And all these intermediary powers and different states completely disappeared from the map. This is phase number 3. And stands also at the center of interest of historians because this is imperial Russia, imperial studies, but we have, as I already said, most of these areas were controlled roughly 100 to 120 years by the Russian Empire, so it's in a perspective of 800 years, not so much. Then the reversal, the entire area we are studying re-emerges on the map. Some as, let's say, re-established states, as Poland, as enlarged states, as Romania, but also new states as, for instance, the Baltic states or completely sovereign Finland. This interwar period, and I will talk about also the, let's say, preconditions for independence a bit later on, did last only roughly 20 years, and then the area was once again then divided between the great power, the famous Hitler-Stalin pact. And here you see the situation after 1945. Russia reached now the apogee of its influence, so in its hypothesis as the European Union with Soviet republic, so most of what was formerly Poland, Lithuania, namely Belarus and Ukraine, were now constituted as Soviet republics. The Baltic states disappeared once again from the map as independent states, and there was, as you know, this chain of vassal states. And then, and this was one of the main achievements, although he certainly never wanted that, you have the present-day situation. And the present-day situation is historically completely new. For the first time in history, the entire European North is united under the same umbrella. It has never been the case since the end of the 14th century. This is Putin's work, that the North, and I will briefly then allude to these deep divisions, but just as for informing you, Denmark has been from the late 15th century to the early 19th century traditional ally of Russia, because hatred between Denmark and Sweden was extremely deep. Denmark wanted to control the north. Sweden was, in their perception, a separatist state, and that's why you have such a long tradition of Danish-Russian alliances, always directed against Sweden. And for Danish historians, this is so embarrassing that they, until the early 20th century, even denied the existence of the first alliance that was concluded in 1493. Because it cannot be that the Scandinavian states is in an alliance against the other Nordic states with Russia to destroy these other Nordic states' independence. And you can see for the first time on history, and this is also, let's say, a part of my conclusion, that Putin in a way has completely reunited United States that had never been together. On the contrary, historically, they have been competitors for centuries. So this is a completely new political landscape that emerged before our eyes in the last couple of years. But now I have to go a bit deeper into the question of the political culture, at least as a very brief outline, to show you what I actually mean. So first, we have to compare, we have to develop in a couple of words what the political culture in Moscow or in Russia was until the early 20th century. So in the 16th century, the idea of autocracy emerged, according to which the Tsar was accountable only to God and to a very vague idea of justice. But certainly he was not responsible before a kind of convened assembly that actually did not exist in a regular way. There was in the 8th of the 16th, early 17th century, the Zemsky Sobor, but actually it never worked and disappeared then in the 17th century. And even when there were assembly, they had no clearly defined powers, and usually they could just acclaim decisions taken by the Tsar. A political culture in which the highest dignitaries referred themselves in their relation to the Tsar as slaves was also quite telling. So they were proud, the main councils were proud to be slaves of the Tsar. And I will just then show you the contrast how people behaved in Poland, Lithuania. And actually law was, and this is also continuity to this day, I mean, there was a kind of written law, but there was only one instance who decided how law could be applied or not, and this was the Tsar. So you could not rely on justice and the law. Dynastic succession was the norm, and Tsars were only elected in times of crisis, so around 1600, because, and this was a very important factor of stability, there were only two dynasties in Russian history, the Rurikids and the Romanovs. And now, I mean, I know this is extremely rough and a superficial description of the system, and because I want to focus briefly now on the system of the Western neighbors. We'll start with Sweden, together with Finland, in terms of territory, one of the biggest states of Europe, of course, very thinly populated. Sweden had since 1435, and then especially from 1527 onwards, its own parliament, the Riksdag, in which, and this is very important, not only nobility, clergy, and the burghers, so the towns were represented, but also the peasants. At least those who had their own land. So not peasants or noble lands, but there was their own curia for the peasants. And this was quite extraordinary. So you had, and this is very important then for Finland under Russian rule, when Russia annexed Finland, this was a country where farmers were used to vote. And Russia understood that, and Tsar Alexander I made something that would have been completely unthinkable in Russia, where peasants were serfs. He went to Finland, and he knew that the Finns, they wanted a recognition of their rights. And he also knew that if Russian serfdom would be implemented in Finland, there will be continuous guerrilla war until the last Finn. The Finns were really ready to fight. And he went there and made shake hands with the peasant. shake hand. The Tsar shook hands with the peasants. Completely unthinkable in Russia, but you can only understand that in Finland. So this happened in 1809, when you know that they have centuries of active political participation of peasants in the parliament. So this is clash of political culture. Language and confession, in this case, are not so important. The second element was that the powers of the king were in a kind of Swedish Magna Carta already legally defined in 1319. So you know the famous English Magna Carta from 1215. A century later, a similar development happened in Sweden. So the king could not do what he wanted. He had a powerful position, but still his competences were clearly defined, something that never happened in Russia. And from the beginning of the early 17th century, even the procedural rules for parliamentary works, for instance, committee work, minutes taking, so technical things that are very important to reconstruct also political decisions, were in all detail and precisely defined. The kings were elected. In Swedish constitutional history, there has been a constant struggle between the parliamentary power and the royal power, so there is no linear development we can observe. And there was always the question if in times of crisis a strong king would not be the better choice than a strong parliament. I will come back to this point later on. Second example is, and I have to go is the Livonian Confederacy. A typical old European states. There was no monarch. There was they also started their own Landtag or Diet in 1435. They are the Teutonic Order, the Deutsche Ritterorden. The nobility, the towns and the bishops were represented in Curia, and their parliamentary procedures were extremely complicated because they even had pre-parliaments. For instance, the towns met in order to prepare parliamentary meetings with the other curia. Many of the towns were Hanse towns, and also the Hanse had regular meetings. So the burghers were really used to a kind of conference culture. I mean, they met twice a year. They had enormous intensity of meetings and procedures, and everything was written down. And it was one of the most complex old European states. But when this state was attacked by Ivan IV, so Ivan the Terrible, in 1558, it was completely unable to react. So it's very interesting. This was really a rule of law. These were parliamentary procedure. This was participation of many stakeholders. But when the autocracy attacked, they were completely overwhelmed and crushed. And then that's why the Baltics were then divided by Poland, Lithuania, and by Sweden. Now we come to the biggest state, Poland, Lithuania, and this is also a key argument. There in Poland, parliamentary tradition started in the 14th century in a very interesting way, because first there were regional parliaments, and then same on the national level emerged, and the system was the following. So on the regional levels, deputies were elected and they got a strict mandate. So they were not free in their decision taking. They had to represent their region of origin, and then after the sessions report back. And when Lithuania joined in the late 14th century Poland, this political culture then spilled over to Lithuania. In the case of Lithuania, it was very important that they had their own written statutes in the Ruthenian language, so older form of Belarusian, and these Lithuanian statutes had a tremendous impact on Muscovite law. So the Muscovite Uложение of 1648 was directly influenced by Lithuanian law. That you can, to simplify things, you can say that the ancestors of present-day Belarusians and Ukrainians heavily influenced the legal culture of Muscovy. So Ukrainians and Belarusians, even the Orthodox nobility, fully participated in a system of parliamentary rule. And what is especially important is that most of the towns in Belarus and in Western Ukraine also imported the German urban law, the Magdeburger Recht, that even, for instance, towns of Kiev were administrated according to Central European norms. This was only abolished in the 19th century, but if you visit these towns, there is still quite a high degree of pride that we were administered according to a general European political culture, and so citizens had their rights, they elected their councils, and so on. And this political culture was internalized, and we can also measure that. Because when in the late 14th and early 16th century, Moscow started its wars of expansion to the west, with an ideology we know. We just take back what belongs to us because these are foreign occupiers or Poles, Catholics or Jesuits and so on, who made a kind of brainwash with the people, and now we liberate them. Then you can measure their reaction. And their reaction was from the 15th century to our days, resistance. Although these people were all Orthodox, they spoke languages quite related to Russian, but what they defended was their political culture. They wanted, in the towns, it was very clear, people knew how subjects are treated in Moscow, they knew that, and this is certainly a kind of parallel you can draw between the present day situation and then. People could compare, and it was not about religion or language, it was the way of living they were defending. And in the Polish political culture, just to explain that, it was a matter of pride to contradict the king in the parliament. The nobility, and in a very harsh way. So in Russia, the councillors were proud to call themselves slaves, and in the Polish parliament, it was the complete opposite, because in legal terms, the king was not, let's say, the counterpart of parliament, he was part of the parliament. So he was not the outside, he was simply a member of the parliament, and was treated as one of them. And it was part of the political culture that you could not only criticize, but directly and harshly attack him. And then nobles were proud about that. Yeah? So you could not only, let's say, in legal terms see the limitations, but also in cultural terms. And that's why also in constitutional concepts, Poland-Lithuania from 1572 is described as a kind of noble republic with elective monarchy. So the king was elected, and the candidates came from all over Europe. Even the Russian Tsar was running for the Polish-Lithuanian throne, and this is something we can perhaps then talk about in the discussion. It's one of the most fascinating cases of clashes of political civilizations. The Russian Tsar, who is almighty at home, has to run as a candidate in an open election, because in the Polish way, every noble could vote. So you had tens of thousands of noblemen who gathered on a field and then elected the king. And of course, there was an election campaign, there was quite a lot of bribery and corruption, but a lot of propaganda. And how can you convince a Polish-Lithuanian voter to vote for a Russian candidate? We can talk about that later on. And a couple of years later, it was the complete opposite. The Polish-Lithuanian king wanted to become Tsar of Muscovy, and there were also negotiations. You could see clash of cultures. Election here, and on the other hand, in the Russian case, conditions were very clear. A Polish-Lithuanian king or prince could become Tsar, but only if he became Orthodox and accepted the full package of Moscow political culture. Immigration of Poles, Lithuanians was forbidden, the presence of the Catholic Church was forbidden, importing Western ideas were forbidden, and so on. And this was all written down. It's one of the most fascinating cases of really entangled political culture. And to end the argument, in the south you had a fourth political culture, and this is the Cossack political culture. Completely different, because at least at the beginning there was no nobility, but there was a free election and even dismissal of leaders. Absolutely unthinkable in Moscow. You can't get rid of the Tsar with violence, but you cannot say, okay, we gather people and now the mandate is over and we elect a new ruler. Then there was very important the idea of personal freedom that did not exist in Moscow. The Cossack was a free man. And a cult of equality and freedom. This was also very important when Cossack society developed and the Cossack nobility emerged. Still this idea, all are equals, and those who pretend to be nobles betray Cossack ideals. And then something we would not believe, political education. Ukrainian politicians belong to the most educated in Baroque Europe because of the Kiev Academy that was founded in the early 17th century. So most Cossack leaders had university studies, studied foreign languages and philosophy. That's why the Ukrainian hetmans probably had a higher level of education than the average European nobleman. And very important, while Russia until 1917 had no constitution. There was no constitution until the downfall of the Tsardom. At the beginning of the 18th century, Ukrainian politicians in exile drafted a constitution for independent Ukraine. Of course, never materialized, but what's important, at that time, they thought in these categories. A country needs a written constitution, and this in a framework where constitution by the Tsars has never been implemented. In the 19th century, the spectrum of political culture even broadened further. I can just briefly refer to some of the developments. In the 19th century, so in occupied Poland, the old idea of a noble nation, I mean, those who could elect were 10% of the population, namely the nobility, was then enlarged, and the peasant majority was brought in, so there was a completely new concept of what nation actually means emerged. In Estonians and Latvians, in a very classical way for national movements, emancipated from German nobility and German urban elites. And in Finland, probably one of the most modern societies of Europe emerged that then also implemented the universal suffrage also for women. Finland was one of the most progressive countries. And if you ask why, it was simply Finland had, in this system you see here, a broad degree of autonomy. And when this was restricted at the end of the 19th century, by Tsar Alexander III, so one of the Tsars Putin admires most, Finns reacted first with a kind of pacifist civilian resistance, and this then laid the fundament for a modern concept of nation that also encompassed women, because everyone participated in this kind of pacifist resistance, so collecting signatures for petitions, developing political parties. And Finland had also, as I said, a long-standing parliamentary tradition. Ladies and gentlemen, in the 20th century, the Moscow Empire collapsed twice. This is also very often overlooked, and twice the societies in the annexed Western territories fought for their freedom. And first this happened in the Russian Revolution, 1917, and the second time in a period most of us experienced, namely in the late 80s and early 90s. And we have now, because this is also an actual question, so how can these smaller societies survive politically and these independent societies in the neighborhood of such a powerful empire? We have to ask, how was it possible that this system collapsed and was transformed in this one, and this system collapsed and was transformed into this one? And these are some lessons we can draw also for the present day. First, in 1917, the Russian Empire collapsed not because of the opposition or the pacifist resistance at the western periphery, but simply under the burden of war. It's also a question we have to ask today. I mean, how we always discuss about how long can Ukraine hold out, but the question applies also for Russia. In the First World War, Russia couldn't, it collapsed. But for all those who wanted to get rid of Russian imperial rule, the constellation was very difficult because the Western powers were allies of Russia and did not support independence movements. The same thing happened also in the early 90s. So it was mainly Germany that, this is a paradox, supported in the first phase until 1918 independence movements. And the essential element was if these new states had armies at their disposal or not. That's why Finns and the Poles, they succeeded. They could win wars against Bolshevik Russians and White Russians, and Ukrainians and Belarusians didn't, and they were divided between the Soviet Union and Poland. And in 1989 and 91, once again, the collapse started in the center of the empire because of Gorbachev's reforms, but So societies were even readier than they were at the end of the First World War. There were strong civic movements, and the main expression is the famous human chain stretching from Tallinn to Vilnius over 600 kilometers, 2 million people. So this is in an area where roughly 6-7 million people live. One of the most impressive demonstration of Pacific resistance joined there for a common protest against the Hitler-Stalin Pact on the 23rd of August 1989 happened this. And then there was another aspect, and I'm now coming closely to my conclusions, because I think this is so important. It was the triumph of international law. When the Baltic states were annexed by the Soviet Union in 1940, the Western states, with the exception of Sweden, never recognized this annexation. And the Soviet Union, from Stalin to Brezhnev, did everything to convince or to force the West into recognition. The West always refused. When the Baltic states in the early 90s became independent, they technically simply reactivated their sovereignty. They were members of the League of Nations in the interwar period, and I think that's because, I mean, we are talking, I'm giving this speech here, I'm coming from Switzerland, a small country, teaching in Austria, a small country, giving the lecture in Slovenia, a small country. These small countries never gave up the idea of their independence. And in the West, political elites, fortunately, also stuck to this idea. Although, I mean, the Soviet Union was a superpower with atomic weapons, and everyone said it's absolutely unthinkable that this country will ever be free once again. Why not recognize what we are witnessing today? And this is one of the very important arguments when it comes to the Donbass negotiations now today in Ukraine. For more than half of a century, these countries disappeared from the map, and then they re-emerged and had not to declare their independence. There was strong Western opposition against reactivating independence because the argument in Washington and in Bonn and in other capitals was we should not weaken Gorbachev. There was an enormous clash in the early 90s between stabilizing the Soviet Union and, let's say, recognizing the rule of law. But this was really one of the cases of triumph of international law. Now, some conclusions. First of all, I think we have to accept that Moscow and Russia grew large because its neighbors were divided. I already referred to these inter-Nordic tensions, and we have these perceptions that these are peaceful socialist welfare states, and everyone loves everyone and is good neighborhood. This is not at all the case. So in the Cold War, Norway and Denmark were NATO states, Sweden was non-aligned, and Finland roughly had to align its foreign policy with Russian interests. And there were deep historical divisions. Just a detail, Norway split from Sweden in 1905, so Norwegian-Swedish relations were always very tense as Danish-Swedish. This has completely disappeared. It's a new phenomenon, but only if we try to understand, let's say, the impact of the Nordic factor. And also Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden, whose, let's say, horrible conflicts in the 17th century prepared and paved the way for Peter the Great, are now allies. Also, this kind of enmity has completely disappeared. A second observation concerns political systems. I already mentioned in the 18th century, Sweden and Poland, Lithuania were vassal states of the Russian Empire, and there was one of the most bizarre phenomena we can observe. Russia guaranteed the hegemonic power of parliaments in these countries. So autocracy was officially, and this was also stipulated and in bilateral treaties, Russia guaranteed the liberty of Poland and the liberty of the Swedish parliament, and by bribery and by also sending troops, influenced parliamentary meetings. In the 18th century, Sweden was known as the most corrupt country in Europe. I mean, you could simply buy Swedish members of the parliament. In Poland, it was even easier. They had the liberum veto, so one member of the parliament could block everything. It was very easy to buy such a politician. So one lesson is also to be drawn when it comes to the relation between the separation of powers. And the lesson these countries learned that parliaments are very important, but if parliaments dominate the executive power, states cannot resist against external threat. The same is, but is also true for, let's say, if the executive power is too strong and has no legitimacy. So this is also a second conclusion that can be drawn from this overview. Thirdly, Moscow benefited mainly in the interwar period, but not only, from its neighbors in ability to establish a new system of collective security. And this is certainly the main experience these countries made in this period, and this explains also their behavior today. Most of them declared neutrality. There was no alliance. These were small countries. They were completely unknown, and they were easy objects for Stalin and Hitler. And what they say is never again. And the second lesson is that even they would wage war, even in the case if everyone tells them the war is lost right from the beginning. As the Ukrainians were told, they have no chance. And this is now the general mood also in Finland and in the Baltic states. And as I said right at the beginning, a completely new security architecture emerged in Europe, and this was indirectly Vladimir Putin's work to reunite or to unite parts of Europe that for centuries have pursued different interests. But above all, and I think this is also one of the main arguments to understand the present-day conflict, these immediate neighbors of Moscow are working closely together for the first time in history because they understand more clearly than Europeans in the West and especially in the South what the war in Eastern Europe at this moment is about, namely what has characterized political culture in these areas from the 14th century onwards, and this is the knowledge and the practice of law and freedom. Thank you very much.
Interesting, but also important. And I'm wondering if it would be possible to publish it in Slovenian, maybe.
With great pleasure, yeah.
Because it opens some new perspectives, and it also shows actually how little we know about the history of the Central Eastern Europe and Eastern Europe. So thank you again for your lecture here. Now I'm opening the discussion. If you have some questions or you want some further explanations, please.
Well, I have one question.
Yeah.
Which is more linguistic than. You were talking about the parliament. How would you, which German word would you use for the parliament?
Yeah, I would use Ständeparlament. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because I mean this is it's estates. Yeah. No, I think that's very, very important. So I simplified that a little bit, but because usually in English you use the word diet for this kind of estates parliament, and of course it's very clear that with the exception of Sweden, in none of these cases demographically the majority participated. In Poland it was about 10%, and there was in Poland it took Polish elites decades to understand if they want to organize resistance against Tsarist occupations, they had to enlarge the understanding of what a noble nation is about. Poland is very proud of their constitution of 1791. At that time, it was one of the most modern constitutions of Europe, and but it was severely criticized by French revolutionaries. They acknowledged that on the one hand side, on paper, this looks very good, but it concerned only 10% of the population, because even Polish revolutionaries at that time, and they were fully people like their leader, Kosciuszko, for instance, he had American experience, participated there in the war against the English, had French experiences, but still, I mean, the mindset was a human being is a noble. The peasants simply, I mean, For them, it was so far away to accept a Polish-speaking peasant as a kind of human being with political rights. And it took them until, let's say, the second half of the 19th century. And then the nation was completely transformed. But it had also a negative side effect, and that affects Polish politics until today. Because in these times of crisis, identity was also very much then built on confession. So a Pole had to be Catholic. And this excluded then Protestants and Orthodox, and I did not mention that, but one of the main, let's say, leverages of Russia and Prussia in the 18th century was their claim to protect religious minority in Poland. And it was true that the Poles really oppressed Protestants, and there were famous cases in Torun, where even Protestants then were executed because of some urban riots, and also the Orthodox were oppressed. And this brings us then to another problem of Polish politics, that they never really succeeded in integrating Orthodox elites. This is, I think, brings us then to another huge problem in the European Union, whose dimension has never been fully recognized. This is the Orthodox dimension in the European Union. Putin is claiming leadership in the Orthodox world. But we have already 3 Orthodox countries in the European Union. We have Greece, we have Bulgaria and Romania. And the Orthodox world is deeply divided, and in Europe it has never been recognized that we should also define what does it mean to be Orthodox and member of the European Union. And why do we simply admit it's out of sheer ignorance? Because the religious dimension, Orthodoxy, is very exotic. No one really knows that. And it's an enormous political tool. And it's very much, and we can learn from the failure of Poland, Lithuania to integrate the Orthodox, because this really concerned areas we are now, let's say, that now should concern Europe, namely Ukraine and Belarus. So this entire conflict we are witnessing now is extremely old story, so going back to the 14th century, and brings us to your question, and it was mainly about this kind of political representation on the noble and the urban level.
Russian, this is not the end. The Russians, Putin will attack some other European country, especially in the Baltics. And the other, no, it will not. It's not possible, because in 4 years they only occupy 20% of the Ukrainian territory. So, from the perspective of the historian, with this knowledge you have, how would you describe, or what would you say about this imperial politics or tendencies in Russian politics? Can we say that it is the politics behind that, or thinking?
If we see the argument, if you read Putin's speeches, you will find arguments that were brought forward by the Grand Duke Ivan III when he invaded Lithuania in late 15th century. And it's sometimes, that's why I said medieval and early modern history that are not part of, let's say, our political thinking matter so much. It's always the same argument. First, we never conquer, we never attack, we just take back what belongs to us. I already mentioned that. Second, it's not a war. I mean, Putin's special operations, so avoiding the term war, you can observe that at the end of the 15th century. Then the little green man, you remember, Crimean invasion, the same method was applied in the late 15th century. And these are now, and I really want to stress that, are not comparisons that I draw. They were drawn by brilliant Russian medievalists, so 10, 15 years ago. Much of this book relies on a kind of Russian scholarship that now has been completely muted. The theory that Belarusians and Ukrainians defended a political culture against Muscovite invaders is not mine. It's Michael Krom's. And Michael Krom is one of the best Russian medievalists. And of course, he could now never publish this kind of books. The comparison between the little green man and the late 15th century was drawn by a young historian who unfortunately passed away at a very early stage, Timushin, a brilliant man. So you could see that there was, even in the early phase of Putin's Russia, a Russian elite of historians who deeply understood, let's say, this imperial tradition. And then there is always the argument of encirclement, very old. We are encircled by our enemies and we have to defend ourselves. And the third element is also very important. Why are wars being waged? In the case of Peter I, when he attacked Sweden, it's very clear he wanted a kind of breakthrough for trade. And this idea that economic reasons stand behind expansion was very widespread in scholarship. But also when we go back to the 16th century, when Ivan the Terrible attacked the Slavonian Confederacy, of course he wanted to conquer ports. But the main arguments, and this is once again, now it's another historian, Alexander Filyushkin, who developed that, also Russian medievalist, it was about ideology. And then it's also other parallel. There is the depraved West. The West is full of heretics. The West is morally rundown. There is only one state who preserves Christian values, and this is Muscovy. And Muscovy is not the new Rome, it's the new Jerusalem. This was the ideology. So the idea, and this is reflected today. So Putin's political thinking is not original. It reflects traditions that are at least 500 years old and were transmitted also in Russian elites. And then there is a fourth aspect, very important, it's about space. It's the idea of Russia has no borders. Russia is endless. Russia is where Russian is spoken and Russians are. So even these Eurasian theoreticians as Dugin, for instance, they stop in Portugal because beyond there is the sea. Yeah? But it's this idea that there is no clear limit of expansion. So the way we are thinking that there are borders and somewhere it has to stop is not reflected in, at least in a certain and very deeply rooted tradition of spatial concepts. And we can, what we do with that knowledge is another question, but we have to take that seriously. And if you study how wars were justified from the late medieval ages onwards to our days, you will be astonished how similar the main arguments and the way of thinking are, notwithstanding the huge differences of systems.
Germany. Could you tell us about that special relationship?
Yeah. I would say, first of all, it's interesting to see to what degree there is awareness of bilateral relations. And in Germany, there is a huge bibliography on Russian and also Prussian Russian relations. In Austria, there is not a single comprehensive monograph on Austro-Russian relationships. There was one attempt by Hans Übersberger, who then became rector of the University of Vienna and a very well-known National Socialist, professor at my institute in the interwar period, but he just published the first volume and then he went into politics. And it's also interesting that this bilateral relation, although it's so important for Austria, is not reflected in this way. I mean, if you want to understand what happened in the German case, there is the entire, the entire dimension of cultural relations, of mutual perceptions, of political cooperation and enmity is covered. In the Austrian case, it's not the case. So that. And this leads us then to some very weird situations. For instance, the most pro-Russian, officially most pro-Russian party, the FPÖ, at least defines itself as a kind of patriot party. But I always ask myself, how can it be that an Austrian patriot is in alliance with a country that crushed the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy. I mean, the First World War started as a conflict between Russia and the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. And then you see how much oblivion is important, because there is a very fragmented view of this relation. And certainly, I mean, over time, Austria, and the ambassador here is here and can certainly correct me, but I have the impression that at least under the new Minister of Foreign Affairs, Beate Meindl-Reisinger, Austria has become much more vocal, yeah, in a way. The other question is, what does this really mean in practical terms? Yeah? But if you have a look on the political map now in Europe, I think it's quite evident that you have a kind of northeast, and the countries I presented briefly in the first part of this lecture, who are really committed to concrete support. And then you have this East Central European, former also Hungarian area, where the situation is much more vague, and you know it also in other neighbor countries of Slovenia, for instance in Croatia, where also there is a deep political divide, at least on the discursive level, and let's say very reduced then concrete action. But I would say, I mean, this is a task for also for intellectuals in Austria, I mean, to study that relation over a very long period of time. If we go back in history, I said Denmark is one of the oldest allies of Russia. The same is true for the Habsburg monarchy. More or less at the same period when the Danes concluded an alliance with Muscovy against Sweden. The Habsburg did that against the Jagiellonian dynasty. It was the huge competition between the Habsburgs and the Jagiellonians for supremacy in East Central Europe. And the Habsburg understood that it's better to conclude an alliance with the enemy of your enemy, and they did that, and that's why these relations go back. And we should also not forget that Austria was one of the powers that took part in the first partition of Poland-Lithuania too. So it's a very complex relation and cannot be reduced to a bilateral one, because Austro-Polish, Austro-Ukrainian, and so on relations are deeply entangled with that. But I mean, we are still waiting for this kind of analysis.
Thank you, Oliver, again for your excellent lecture. Hvala lepa tudi za udeležbo na današnjem predavanju.
Dankeschön.